Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for today's video, which is the first part of a series based on serial killer Dennis Nilsen. So I have a serial killers series that I have done for a long time, and although I don't update or add to it regularly, every so often I do. We've talked about the Ken and Barbie killers. We've talked about Myra Hindley, Ian Brady. We've done a lot of these series, and I have linked them in the description box if you haven't seen them yet. And basically, the serial killer series, it's a deep dive into these serial killers, their crimes, and sort of trying to understand why, what happened, what went wrong, and in the end, was justice served? Recently, a documentary called Memories of a Murderer, the Nilsen tapes, came out on Netflix, and I watched it, and I found myself intrigued about this man who I honestly had never heard of before. A little embarrassed to admit that. London has had their share of serial killers, right? We all know about Jack the Ripper, and then there was John Christie, who was active during the 1940s and 50s. We also have John George Hay, best known as the acid bath killer, and the Camden Ripper, Anthony John Hardy. And as an aside, I don't think anyone should give their son the first or middle name of John because I see a pattern here. All right, I see a pattern here. Although Dennis Nilsen himself would like to consider himself Britain's most prolific serial killer, he still plays second fiddle to Harold Shipman, whose total number of victims was over 200. However, compared to someone like Jack the Ripper, who is believed to have been responsible for roughly 5 deaths, John Christie and John Hay with their 6, and Anthony Hardy with his 3, Nilsen has them all beat. He confessed to murdering 15 to 16 young men between 1978 and 1983. However, he was only convicted on 12 of these murders, and only 8 of his victims have been identified. Nilsen would later tell police that by the time he got caught, he had lost count. But in reality, he never did think that he would get caught because he'd gone undetected for so long. After his arrest, Nilsen said, quote, "I was in a quasi-godlike role. I thought I could do anything I wanted. There were people upstairs and people next door, and nobody knew," end quote. But Nilsen did not just take his victims' lives. He was given the moniker the kindly killer because he had this post-murder ritual of bathing his victims, carefully dressing them, and keeping them in his home for an extended period of time to talk to them and hang up with them. Sometimes he would even prop their lifeless bodies up in chairs so that he could chat with them for hours. And when he wasn't pulling them out to play with them or to have a conversation with them, they were hidden snugly under the floorboards of his flat until the warmer weather came, and then he would bring them out and dispose of them, either in a bonfire or by boiling their bodies and flushing the flesh down the toilet. So, I mean, that was one hell of an intro, right? Whew, it's intense. These cases, this man, he's intense and truly disturbed. And you'll see what I mean. But before we continue, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Native. By now, I'm sure everyone knows I love Native. I really do. There are honestly dozens of reasons why, but let's go over the Cliff Notes version so I'm not talking about Native for 3 hours, because I could. Native's deodorants are made with familiar and simple ingredients that you know and recognize, such as coconut oil and shea butter. They are aluminum and paraben-free, as well as vegan and cruelty-free. But you know what they aren't free of? Awesomeness. They have tons of awesomeness. First of all, Native's deodorants work, and they stay on all day, keeping me smelling pretty even after exercising. And you guys know I can get intense, all right? So I go hard when I'm exercising. I go hard on the rower, and it could potentially be a bad situation with the sweating and the smelling, but it's not because I have Native. The texture of Native's deodorants, they're great. They are non-sticky. They dry really fast when you put them on, which is awesome for when you're on the go because, sometimes your deodorants are kind of like moist still and you don't want to put your clothes on. That's not a problem with Native. Native's deodorants also come in a wide range of scents. They have scents that they usually are offering, on the regular, like eucalyptus and mint, one of my favorites. They also have special edition scents, though. These 3 deodorants right here, they are my all-time favorite scents. And I know I say that every time a new season comes and there's new scents, but oh my God, I love these. First of all, where is it? Cherry and vanilla macaron. Officially my new favorite of all time. It smells so good. Do you guys remember the Jergens Cherry Almond Lotion? It's like a staple of my childhood. Well, this brings me back. I gotta tell you, it smells so good. And look how cute. I know I talk about this all the time, and you probably think it's not important, but there's a heart. There's a heart on the bar. How sweet is that? We also have Earl Grey and Mulberry. Awesome. And then the lavender and rose. And I never like lavender. I hate the scent of lavender, but I love this. Also, be sure to check out Native's simple, effective, and festive holiday limited edition scents like the joyful scents of sugar cookie, candy cane, and fresh mistletoe. Native also cares about the planet, so they offer their same great deodorant, same great product, same great formula in plastic-free packaging. And they don't just have deodorant. Native offers body washes, which are the best body washes I've ever used on my life, I swear to God, as well as toothpaste. So if you're looking for stocking stuffers that your loved ones will actually appreciate and use, look no further. Now, 3 deodorants are normally $36, but if you click the link in the description box and use my code StephanieH14, you'll get them for $24. That's 33% off. With my code StephanieH14, you can also get 20% off any body wash or toothpaste, so make sure to stock up on those because I have. Thank you so much to Native for sponsoring this video. Great company. I love their products. I use them constantly. You could come to my house right now and Native products will be all over the place. Thank you so much to Native. Thank you for sponsoring this video, and let's dive in. In the early evening of February 8th, 1983, the clearage company Dino Rod was called to 23 Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill neighborhood of London. The company had sent 29-year-old plumber Michael Catran, who was told that the building's tenants were having issues flushing their toilets, and they were also complaining of an awful smell that would not go away. 23 Cranley Gardens was built in the late 1800s, but in more modern times, many of the spacious mansions that lined the shaded streets of Muswell Hill were turned into multi-family units. Muswell Hill is one of the most desirable locations to live in London. Said to derive from the words mossy well, Muswell Hill's higher elevation places it above the fog that London is famous for, and gives its residents stunning views of the city, seemingly sprawling out endlessly in front of them. But when Michael Catran approached 23 Cranley Gardens on this particularly chilly February evening, the sun had already set, leaving the sky a dusky pink, and leaving Michael, who was headed towards what should have been a standard job like any other, with a chilled-to-the-bone feeling. Michael headed straight to the drain at the side of the building, and he lifted the manhole cover. Later, he would tell reporters, quote, "I could tell it was full, so the blockage was between that and the manhole cover. There was such a terrible stench when I lifted the manhole cover and climbed down 12 feet to the bottom. When I got down there, I couldn't believe it." End quote. Michael did not find the usual things that plumbers encounter when cleaning out clogged pipes. He didn't find large clumps of hair or congealed masses of cooking oils. He didn't find dirty diapers or soggy spaghetti. He was faced with something much more horrifying. Michael Catran said, quote, "I pulled out lumps of flesh the size of my fist and strips of flesh that looked as though they had been cut from an arm. I went down again with a plunger. As I pushed down towards the mains, the whole lot moved and my bottle went. There was a bit of hair on it. The flesh was so white, and there was such a lot of it. I was trying to think what sort of animal it could be. As I was prodding around, I thought, it's obviously not a dog. There's no fur. It was all bruised up, and eventually I got to thinking that it had to be a body." End quote. Michael got back to high ground, and he called his boss, a man named Gary Wheeler. Michael told Gary that he was never going to believe him, but he thought he had found the remains of a human body in the drain. At this time, Michael was losing light quickly. It was getting darker, so Gary told him to go home and sleep on it, and they would both return together the next day so they could hopefully get a better look by the light of the morning sun. As Michael stood outside, looking down into the open manhole, a few residents of 23 Cranley Gardens gathered around him, wondering if he had discovered the cause of their plumbing problems. One of these residents was 37-year-old Dennis Nilsen, who lived on the top floor of the building, and who had been one of the most vocal tenants when expressing his frustration about the blocked pipes to the building's landlord. Nilsen had threatened his landlord with non-payment of the rent until he got the issue fixed, and now he stood next to Michael Catran looking for answers, right along with his neighbors. When Michael told Dennis what he had found in the drain, Dennis said casually, quote, "It looks like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken," end quote. He was casual, he didn't seem concerned, and he appeared to be as in the dark about what the mysterious bits of flesh were as anyone else. But later, after Michael went home to have a stiff drink, neighbors saw Dennis Nilsen creeping around the drain under the cover of darkness. The next morning, Michael returned with his boss, Gary, but he was surprised to find that the horrors he had discovered the night before were now gone, vanished, as if into thin air. Not wanting Gary to think he had made the whole thing up, or worse, imagined it, Michael crawled back down into the drain, determined to find something that proved his story. He emerged with 4 bones that resembled fingers, and he compared these bones to his own fingers, saying, quote, "I lined the fingers up with my own and thought they could be that bit from the palm to the first knuckle, and other bits up the second joint," end quote. At this point, the police were called, and by that evening, Dennis Nilsen was under arrest in custody and telling law enforcement a gruesome story that they would never forget for as long as they lived. Dennis Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland. Founded by Alexander Fraser, 8th Lord of Philorth, who built his castle there in 1570, Fraserburgh is the biggest shellfish port in Scotland and one of the largest in Europe. It's a fishing town with mild summers and cool winters, and during the coldest months, it can get quite windy. Like most places in Scotland, it is unbelievably beautiful, with various rocky beaches, stunning sea views, and rolling hills, which is why Fraserburgh is known as Scotland's hidden treasure. Dennis Nilsen, like most serial killers, came from a complicated family. His mother, Elizabeth White, was an attractive woman who was also known to have a sharp tongue, and she was not afraid to use it. Betty was not a woman you would want to go toe-to-toe with in an argument, and Dennis remembered her as a hard and strong woman who didn't show much tenderness or warmth towards anyone. Later, Dennis would describe his mother as emotional ice until she was upset, and then her temper would explode like a volcano. When she was in her 20s, Betty met her future husband while she was working in a factory. Little is known about Olav Magnus Moksheim. We know he was born in Norway. We know he was a member of the Free Norwegian Forces who were loyal to the King of Norway. During World War II, Olav fled his country after the Nazis occupied Norway in April of 1940, and he changed his last name to Nilsen and became an exile. Betty and Olav would have their first child together in 1943. His name was Olav Jr. Now, according to Dennis, Olav Jr. was the only true child of Betty and Olav Sr. because his father was still fighting the Axis powers in the army and he was away from home much of the time. When Olav was home, he and his wife's father, Andrew White, argued constantly. Betty lived with her parents, Andrew and Lily Duthie, at 47 Academy Road. This was an arrangement made necessary by the fact that her husband was rarely around. Betty's father, Andrew, who had fought in World War II and worked as a fisherman, he disapproved of how much Olav drank. Andrew apparently was a fundamentalist Christian, and he didn't drink, nor did he approve of alcohol being consumed, especially under his roof. Now, Dennis does not believe that he or his younger sister Sylvia share the same father as Olav Jr. because his mother and Olav Sr. went their separate ways in 1945, the same year that Dennis was born, and Sylvia would be born 2 years later in 1947. And at this point, in 1947, Olav Sr., knowing that Sylvia was not his true and biological child, filed for divorce officially. In his autobiography, History of a Drowning Boy, Dennis said, quote, "I was conceived in February of 1945 and born at 4 a.m. on November 23rd of that year, by which time my mother was dating other men. As she was still married at the time, Olav Magnus Nilsen's name as the father was put on my birth certificate, though he had doubts about my paternity," end quote. Dennis also commented that neither he nor his sister Sylvia shared Olav Jr.'s physical features. Olav Jr. and Olav Sr. had light coloring and blonde hair, while Dennis and Sylvia had darker features. After the divorce, Olav Sr. left Scotland forever, returning to Norway, where he would go on to be married 3 more times before dying in 1973. You've got to think, when you've got a father like that, somebody who doesn't even care to be around, maybe it's better that he's not around. Dennis Nilsen says he never knew who his biological father was, but he claims that his mother, when she was angry with him at one point, she yelled at him and told him that he wouldn't know his own father if he saw him on the street, which led Dennis to believe that his real father may have lived right in their own town. He said sometimes Betty would tell her children stories about how she would dance the night away during the war with servicemen and local policemen, and she mentioned the name of one policeman, specifically an Inspector Burns. So Dennis suspected maybe Inspector Burns was his father. This left little Dennis with no actual father figure, but his grandfather, Andrew White, seemed to take a special interest in him, which Dennis was appreciative of because he often felt overlooked by the other adults in his life, because basically, besides his grandfather Andrew, it was just women in the home. And as a young boy, Dennis, I guess, didn't feel that he could relate to the women or they couldn't relate to him. His little sister Sylvia was a baby who needed a lot of attention, and Dennis felt that Olav Jr., his oldest brother, was his mother's favorite, the apple of her eye. He often felt that his mother hadn't wanted him and didn't love him. Many years later, after her middle child was arrested for killing multiple people, Betty, when asked by the Guardian why she thought her son had become a serial killer, said, quote, "It was nothing I had done. He was brought up the same as my other children," end quote. Betty said that Dennis was a delightful child, a delightful baby, and she loved him as soon as she held him in her arms. As we move forward in this timeline, Dennis Nilsen is going to make some salacious allegations, and what we have to understand is not all of it is true. The problem is we don't know what is true and what isn't. We only have opposing statements from the people who were involved. Michael Hart, who directed the Netflix documentary, he describes Nilsen as an unreliable narrator. He said he was a person who lied to himself and others to create a narrative because he didn't want to take responsibility for what he had done. After the divorce, Betty and her 3 children had moved into her parents' house permanently, and Dennis Nilsen described his childhood home as drab and colorless, with heavily curtained windows and framed religious texts hanging on the wall. It was a place dominated, like I said, mostly by women: his mother Betty, her sister Lily, his grandmother, who was also named Lily, and Dennis's little sister Sylvia. He said that the house smelled of lavender and mothballs, and when he would look out the window, all he could see for miles were the forever gray vistas. In his book, Nilsen says, quote, "In this rough bower, I was cradled and spawned by the triple angels of ignorance, poverty, and religious fundamentalism. I cried a lot with a spasmodic response, and I was screamed at, probably to be quiet," end quote. But when his grandfather Andrew wasn't out at sea, Andrew would spend a lot of time with Dennis, and the little boy who didn't have a male figure to look up to, he ate up all the attention he could get. However, Dennis Nilsen claims that his grandfather Andrew had dark and ulterior motives in taking him under his wing. Dennis said that Andrew White was a good and moral man, but he also had a fantasy life that he would escape to when real-world pressures and stress became too much for him. Dennis said, quote, "I arrived as that object to his problems, and my presence tempted him as the devil tempts all men who in his religious mind were all sinners. He levied and controlled his secret with the mind and body of a small, uncomprehending male child soiled by bastardy," end quote. According to Dennis, his grandfather would whisk him off to remote locations outside of Fraserburgh. They would usually end up along the sand dunes of Fraserburgh Bay, and they would sit beside an abandoned World War II concrete bunker. Andrew White always had a flask with him, and inside of it was something he called tea. He would tell Dennis to drink this tea, and as Dennis began to feel sleepy, Andrew would undress him and then sexually abuse him. Afterwards, Andrew would behave like a good grandfather, as if nothing had happened, and he would take his grandson to get ice cream or to the corner store for candy. Dennis said, quote, "These were my only real one-to-one contacts with someone who took a beneficial interest in me, and my conscious memory was of his strength and a feeling of comfort and security. His was the earliest embrace I could remember, and it seemed correct necessary, and irreversible. He may have been a pedophile, but I didn't remember him as threatening or oppressive." End quote. Okay, so let's address this, the elephant in the room. The allegations that Dennis Nilsen have made about his grandfather molesting him, they have never been proven. There is no proof or evidence. Now, of course, Nilsen's family members denied that this happened. Nilsen has also said that his mother was a cold, hard woman who he was never close to, but she denies this as well. And there is evidence that he was lying about that. There's evidence that his mother tried to have a relationship with him his whole life, and Dennis was the one who pulled away and created the distance between them. Russ Coffey is a journalist who corresponded with Nilsen for 20 years after the murderer's arrest, and he would go on to write the book Dennis Nilsen, Conversations with Britain's Most Evil Serial Killer. Russ says he first reached out to Nilsen in the late 90s after he found out that Nilsen was planning to write a self-glorifying autobiography, and through years and years of letters and phone calls, Coffey came to know the serial killer well. Russ Coffey said, quote, "He was an intensely controlling man. Even though we never met face to face, there was always a sense in his letters that it could turn unpleasant if he were ever to be challenged." End quote. Nilsen told Coffey that he'd had a loveless childhood. He said he was a dog who had never been patted. But Coffey doesn't believe a lot of what Nilsen claimed because he feels this was the narrative Nilsen came up with in order to gain sympathy and understanding from others who truly did go through very traumatic childhoods. And this worked. Nilsen did gain sympathy, empathy, understanding, and support from people like this. Coffey said, quote, "I have seen letters from emotional women who wanted to share his loneliness and men who enclosed photographs of themselves. Many of them seemed willing to overlook his crimes." End quote. Throughout his life, Nilsen would imagine himself as an actor in a movie, but not only the actor, the star of the movie, also the director, the producer. He would say that at times he could see the lights of the movie set and hear the soundtrack of the film he was living in. He could both be the actor saying his lines and the director watching himself from the outside. Thus, Dennis Nilsen became very adept at knowing how to play a role and how to lay out a narrative. His fantasies, his crimes, and his outward life all existed in separate mental compartments, and he did not allow them to mix with each other. Russ Coffey said, quote, "Dennis Nilsen was not, as he wanted us to believe, an exceptional person destroyed by a murderous flaw. He was just a vile sex criminal whose brain lacked a crucial component." End quote. So about whether or not Andrew White actually did these things to his young grandson, or whether it was just another storyline created by Nilsen as the director and actor of his own life story to create a justification for what he would go on to become, we'll never really know. Director Michael Hart said, quote, "This is Nilsen's version of what happened. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But for me, it was clear that I knew I couldn't present it as the truth because for me, it didn't seem to be the case." End quote. And that's basically what I'm telling you here. I'm not telling you I know for sure what happened, and that's Dennis Nilsen's own fault because he has lied about things before, and they are usually things that make him look like the victim instead of the monster he actually was. What we do know is true when it comes to Dennis's grandfather, Andrew, is that the man died at the age of 62 on October 31st, 1951. Andrew had been out to sea when he suffered a massive heart attack. Dennis was only 5 years old, and the death of his grandfather apparently had a huge impact on him. Dennis Nilsen claims he never told anyone about the abuse from Andrew because he was both dependent on Andrew and fearful of him, which seems to me like a contradiction because he literally said that he didn't remember his grandfather as oppressive or threatening. When Andrew died, it was Dennis's first encounter with the fact and mystery of death. Mortality salience is the awareness of your own inevitable end. We all go through it at one point in our lives, but at different times. For the record, 5 years old, that's kind of young for mortality salience because a fear of death decreases as you get older. At least that's what the experts say. I feel like my fear of death has gotten worse as I've gotten older because it's like I'm watching this hourglass just dump out the grains of sand that represent my life. At least when I was like 15 or 20, I could say, oh, got a lot of time left. But as I approach 40, that's less comforting and less true. Anyways, kids don't have the mental capacity to understand what death means. And if you come to the conclusion at too young of an age that you are going to die one day, it's traumatic. It's impactful, usually in a negative way. At the age that Dennis was when his grandfather died, he would have still viewed death as being this temporary and reversible thing, and kids in the age group between 4 and 7 years old will often feel responsible and blame themselves when someone close to them passes away. Children at this age still use magical thinking, where everything in the world revolves around them and they believe that they have control over what happens to them and around them. Children at this age will also connect occurrences that have nothing to do with each other. For example, if a young boy brings his stuffed bear to school one day, and on that same day his mother goes into cardiac arrest and dies while he's at school, he may believe that bringing that toy to school caused the death of his mother. When Andrew White died, the family laid him out in the main room of his home, which was the custom at that time and in that place, and visitors would come in and out and pay their respects and say goodbye. Dennis's mother carried him in and brought him over to the coffin, and Dennis remembered feeling what he called a great earthquake of excitement when he saw Andrew laying dead in the coffin. Dennis Nilsen said, quote, "I had lost the good aspect of him as well as the painful trauma of his abuse. I had wished him gone, and he had gone, and the guilt came from this and my excitement and sense of loss at viewing the mighty fallen slumbering in that coffin in the room where I had been born. I was not clear on the full meaning of death, and I felt that he could have still got me if I revealed our secret." End quote. Dennis says he was also confused when afterwards his grandfather was just gone, and the adults told him that Andrew was in a better place. He was in heaven, but Dennis knew that he was in a coffin buried under the ground, and he claims that this caused some disconnect. If Andrew was dead and buried, were the adults saying that being dead was this better place? Was being dead a good thing? If we believe Dennis Nilsen, we might say this was the first misconnection in his brain. You know how when you're setting up a computer and there's all these cords and cables, and if you plug one of them in wrong, something isn't going to work. Like one of the speakers isn't going to work, something like that. Maybe one of Nilsen's cords was plugged into the wrong port in his brain. Maybe thinking that death was a better place may have been the first step to becoming a person who brought death to so many. Within a few weeks after Andrew's death, life went back to normal for Dennis and his family, although he no longer had a male role model in his home. As a child, Dennis was always a bit removed, shy, and withdrawn, but he had an early talent for art. Later, his mother Betty would say that Dennis was always interested in the arts and the classics, and everyone felt that he would pursue art in his adult life. When he was about 6, he painted a Viking longship in his class, and it was chosen to be displayed at an exhibit in London. Dennis and his family were invited to attend the exhibit, but they were hundreds of miles away from London, and no one had that kind of money to pay for the trip. As he grew, Dennis felt awkward in every possible way. He would be quite tall, and his shoulders took on this rounded form that his mother brought him to see a specialist about, but the doctor didn't have any answers other than to suggest physical therapy, so Betty lost interest as there was no quick fix. Dennis said that he felt there was this female passiveness about him for as long as he could remember, and although he preferred the company of girls and he enjoyed talking to them, he was not attracted to them in a physical way or a romantic way. His interest in other boys started with his own brother, Olav Jr. In his autobiography, Dennis said, quote, "I had always accepted that my half-brother Olav was more beautiful than myself, and I envied his fair hair and began looking up to him. As we shared a bed, I imagined his body being in close proximity to mine, as attached to another boy created in my imagination, and I was drawn to feel his soft skin as he slept, half remembering the intensity of being regularly felt and fondled by my grandfather." End quote. But Dennis didn't stop there. He didn't stop at imagining or fantasizing. He would eventually begin acting out his desires with his brother while Olav slept. I'm not going to go into detail about what he did to his brother or how he did it, or how carefully and quietly he did it so that his brother wouldn't wake up. But Dennis, he was messed up. He did some messed up things to his brother, but he also said that he felt that sometimes Olav was awake and just pretending to be asleep, and he never tried to stop Dennis. However, Dennis also claims that later Olav would start making fun of him in front of others, calling him hen, which apparently is the same thing as calling him a girl. Dennis figured that Olav had realized what he was doing to him, and now he was ridiculing him for it, which I mean, yeah. First of all, that's your brother, so you shouldn't be doing that stuff to or with him. Secondly, you did it without his permission. You did it without his consent. It's awful and a horrible abuse of trust. And we see this a lot with Dennis Nilsen. He attributes feelings, emotions, sentiments to other people, even though he doesn't know what their true feelings are. So Dennis would say, oh, I was molesting and fondling my brother and doing horrible things to him while he was asleep, but he was awake. He knew about it and he never tried to stop me. Dude, you don't know what your brother Olav was feeling. You don't know if he was awake and he was scared or traumatized or confused about what was going on, and that's why he didn't say anything. You don't know if he actually just is a deep sleeper and didn't wake up during the whole thing. You're just pretending he did so you can justify what you're doing to Olav. You don't know, but Dennis does this all the time. He'll say, oh, he was probably feeling this way, or he probably thought this. And Dennis doesn't talk about this in his autobiography, but it's very likely he molested both his older brother Olav and his younger sister Sylvia. But he did tell the Mirror, a paper in the UK, that at some point in his childhood he realized he was gay and he felt shamed by this, and he was always attracted to boys and men who resembled his brother or his sister. And this makes a lot of sense because in Scotland, being gay was illegal until the year 1980, I think, very early on in the 1980s. So this would have been a very hard thing to go through as a young boy who has figured out that he is gay, but he can't tell anyone about it because it's considered wrong and bad and immoral and illegal. Nick Mitchell and Phil Duffy believe that they are the longest married gay couple in Scotland, and they remembered growing up during a time when their love was considered evil and punishable. Phil Duffy said, quote, I think I suffered a kind of trauma. Even though the law changed in Scotland in 1980, I was getting messages, you're wrong, you're diseased, you're this, you're that. So I shut my mouth and I suppressed all that. Natural urges and so on does have an effect on you, end quote. So we could say that because Dennis was not able to be who he was inside on the outside, that he sort of fractured, his personality fractured. And we could say that this may have had an effect on what he became. In 1954, Dennis, his siblings, and his mother moved to a 2-bedroom council flat in downtown Fraserburgh at 73 Mid Street. And Dennis remembers actually feeling very happy there. He had friends. He seemed to fit in. He and Olav were enrolled in the Life Boys. So today the Life Boys is called the Boys Brigade. And it is the largest Christian uniformed youth organization in the United Kingdom and Ireland. I'm not laughing at the organization. The Boys Brigade is just a funny name. I don't want anybody to be offended. It's just a funny name. Founded by Sir William Alexander Smith in Glasgow in 1883, the organization was meant to develop Christian manliness using semi-military discipline, physical activity, and religious classes. It is said that Dennis Nilsen also loved animals from a very young age. He would rescue baby pigeons and build them pigeon boxes so he could care for them until they were ready to fly away. His mother, Betty, remembered that she would tell him he needed to remember that when the pigeon was better, Dennis would have to let it go. And he told her he understood, but every time when it was time for the bird to fly away, she could sense his sadness. And this is actually interesting. I actually did not make this connection before, but as I'm saying it, knowing what Dennis would go on to do, how he would basically kill these men and then keep them in his house so he could talk to them and have company, it makes sense why he was sad to see the pigeons go. And I wonder if all those pigeons made it home alive. Because although Dennis loved animals and took care of these baby birds, he also claimed in his own autobiography that he had once strangled a cat with a wire and watched it die, saying, quote, after it was dead, I prodded it and turned away, disgusted by my cruel behavior. I wanted to see the reality and the process of killing and death, though I wasn't excited sexually by the act, and I have that guilt still with me today in its original, raw intensity, end quote. It was after they finally had their own place that Betty began to look for a husband. She was still young and attractive, and within no time she met a man named Adam Scott, who was a good, hardworking, and simple person, and he absolutely adored Betty, which was just fine with her because she liked being adored, and she preferred to be the dominant one in her relationships. Now, Dennis seems fairly indifferent about Adam, but he did seem to pity him a bit. Dennis said, quote, I felt both resentful and sorry for this man who had to cycle 8 miles to Striken Quarry every day to work in all weathers. I can still see him in his armchair in front of the fire in the evening, asleep, exhausted by yet another hard day's labor, end quote. In September of 1954, Dennis began attending Fraserburgh Central School, and this is where he begins to spot boys on the playground or around town, and then he becomes obsessed with them, and he starts fantasizing about them. I'm going to tell you a few incidents of this as he goes through childhood and into adulthood, but I couldn't possibly give you every occurrence of this. There's a lot, and you'll start to see some patterns. For instance, he refers to them all constantly as beautiful, and he expresses a feeling to want to be physically close to them, and he eventually begins to feel that if these boys that he's attracted to would be sleeping or unconscious, things would be even better because then he could do whatever he wanted to them, and they wouldn't be able to shame him, or leave him, or reject him. One of the first times he experienced these feelings was towards a young boy at school who Dennis never spoke to. He never even knew his name, but he started thinking about him all the time and feeling protective and warm towards him. In 1956, Dennis and his family moved to 16 Bard Road in Stryken, which is 8 miles southwest of Fraserburgh. His stepfather, Adam, had been given a council house which was closer to his job, but Dennis hated Stryken, which was more rural. He missed the hustle and bustle of Fraserburgh, which was a busy port city with a lot to see and do. And as Adam and Betty went on to have 4 more children together, Dennis's feelings of being unwanted and pushed to the side grew. He remembered that one year, Adam's sister got married. But when they received the invitation to the wedding, it only included Adam, Betty, and Olav Jr. Dennis felt that he and his sister had been purposely excluded due to their bastard status, and his mother, Betty, was enraged by this. Apparently, she felt the same way, and she stood up for her children, and she announced that none of them would be attending the wedding if Dennis and Sylvia were not invited. After that, there was a big break between Adam's family and their own, and Betty never reconnected with her husband's family. Now, to me, that doesn't sound like a mother who disliked or resented her children. It sounds to me like she had their backs, at least in the times when it mattered. Maybe she wasn't overly emotional. Maybe she wasn't the kind of feminine woman that Dennis, was used to, because he's very sexist, okay? He's very sexist. And I think what happened here with his mother, and just my personal opinion, was he had these very black and white ideas about what was masculine and what was feminine. And if you didn't fit into one category, you would fit into the other. So when Dennis's mother, Betty, was very aggressive and had a temper and spoke her mind, was assertive, liked to be dominant, he was like, oh, she's just as cold as ice. Instead of realizing that not all women are incredibly maternal and warm and gushing and just emotions flying out of every orifice. But let me know what you think about this in the comment section. I'm interested to know. Does Betty standing up to her husband and her husband's family and basically breaking ties with them because of her 2 younger children who were not invited to this wedding, does that sound like this cold, horrible mother who doesn't love or care about her children? Now, during this time, Dennis remembered his mother watched a lot of television, and he loved when she watched the ballet because he liked to stare at the men dancers, especially focusing on how their tights, their dancing tights, left little to the imagination. Now, as the family grew, money became more tight at home, so the older children, Olav, Dennis, and Sylvia, they felt compelled to get jobs and help out. Dennis would get up at 5 a.m. and he would run through his paper route. He would then go home to do his chores there, and by 9 a.m. he was in school, nodding off by the radiator, trying to shake the cold and wetness off of him that had settled on his body and his clothes from being out in the morning fog delivering papers. At one point, he actually had to be hospitalized after he got pneumonia, and he was at the Aberdeen City Hospital for 2 weeks. As a result of this, he fell behind in his schoolwork and he was moved into C Stream, which is the lowest level. And in C Stream, many of his classmates were the sons of farmers who also missed a lot of school during planting and harvesting seasons. Dennis claims he did not have much in common with them because he was a town boy and he had no empathy for farm talk. He's also very focused and concerned with class differences, class structure, wealth disparities. He mentioned that a lot of these farm boys had been raised as Tories, but he'd been raised in a house of labor voters, so he considered himself a poor working class kid, and he looked at the children of farmers as more like upper class kids who felt they were superior to him, but they never acted superior to him. He just assumed they would be. As Dennis got older, he developed a new hobby, a new passion, and a new interest. He began to watch a lot of movies, and because of the absence of a father figure in his life, he kind of started to get inspiration from the characters in these films so that he could invent a male presence. And it's crazy because Marilyn Monroe did this too. I want to make a series on Marilyn Monroe one day. I don't know if you guys would like that or be into it. Maybe I'll do a podcast about her, but she is a very interesting figure. She also did this. She would look at the male actors in movies, and she'd say, maybe that guy's my dad. Maybe that guy's my father. And she would kind of fantasize about it. Now, at first, Dennis Nilsen used Jimmy Stewart for this father figure, but when Dennis began to feel sexually attracted to Jimmy Stewart, he switched to John Wayne, a real man's man that Dennis felt he could look up to. However, Dennis eventually came to the conclusion that, yes, John Wayne was strong and masculine, but he probably would not be very sympathetic to Dennis's circumstances, a young gay man living in a society where he could not be his true self. So, Dennis settled on Gary Cooper, feeling that he was the most truly correct father figure for him. In his autobiography, Nilsen says, quote, "My moments of real happiness were at the picture house, and I took the language of the cinema out into my real life to make it more tolerable. Cinema became such a central focus in my expanding fantasy life that when I was on my own and in adventures in the great outdoors with other kids, I imagined that I was in a movie. I approached my situations and surroundings from the point of view of the movie camera, and in my inner eye, I granted titles and even music. Life looked better through the oblong frame of the movie screen format, and this preoccupation consumed the greater part of my young life. I had no wish to leave my fantasy land where I could be in the movies just by viewing myself in the mirror's frame. If nobody appears to love you, you can always love yourself," end quote. I mean, that last sentence, a healthy sentiment, you'd think, right? Like, you have to love yourself before someone else can love you. But in this case with Dennis Nilsen, he means something different than we think he means. When Dennis was 15 years old, he saw the movie Psycho, and he felt attracted to Anthony Perkins in his role as Norman Bates. Dennis was gripped by sexual excitement, especially during the shower scene, and what he says about this movie and this scene is important. He says, quote, "From the close-up of Janet Leigh's staring eyes to her being put, clear plastic wrapped, into the car boot, the image of her being carried was the most intense of all. It was not the Janet Leigh figure that aroused me, but a vision of myself in this extreme state of passivity, juxtaposed with me as Anthony Perkins as well. In my deeper imaginings, I refined and expanded on the script to suit," end quote. So Dennis began having sexual fantasies about Norman Bates exerting dominance and control over him, and in his book, he goes into great detail about these fantasies, which I won't do, but you're welcome, because trust me, it is twisted. One summer, Dennis happened upon his brother, Olav Jr., on the beach, being sexual with a girl. Dennis said his brother was holding this girl down by her arms, and she was pretending to struggle before giving in. Dennis stood there and watched them, feeling excited as he felt that he was witnessing this girl's sexual awakening and his brother's rising male potency. Not long after, Dennis claims he was pinned down in a similar way by an older, stronger boy who then fondled him, and Dennis felt, at this happening, a mixture of rage and excitement. So on another day, he did the same thing to a younger boy, saying, quote, "It proved my power over another boy when I could render him powerless to prevent me grabbing his privates. It was an embryonic sex act, perhaps a rehearsal," end quote. This dude's so weird. Dennis did this again to another boy, saying, quote, "I cared for him, and I didn't want to hurt him. I felt a great wave of excitement at our close physical contact and that I'd overprotected him, a member of a superior class, beautiful and so seemingly untouchable. We didn't speak as I held him there for at least a minute, the only language being our eye contact. Slowly I stood up and it was over. I hadn't attempted to gain any sexual intimacy with his private parts, and I let him get up and asked him if he was all right before we went our separate ways," end quote. And you can tell by the way he describes things, which, I mean, I have to admit, he describes things quite well, but this flowery language where he does feel like he's writing a movie script, he does feel like he's in a movie, and he's attributing all of these emotions, and he's romanticizing things. Like, you're abusing other children, and you're romanticizing it like an embryonic sex act, a rehearsal, if you will. The only contact we had was our eyes gazing into it. Like, this is not a romantic situation. This is probably an incredibly traumatic situation for the kids you're doing this to. So if we believe Dennis, it was less about sex and more about control. And I do. I believe Dennis in that aspect. But in some people's minds, those two things are one and the same. According to Psychology Today, sex is never a mutually emotional experience for a psychopath, and they are motivated by power. Everything is a means to an end. They don't usually have sex because they like it. They do it because they need to boost their ego, since they're constantly feeling rejected. So they want to obtain power and fight against the constant boredom that they feel. Dennis also reported having dark thoughts and nightmares of drowning. He said, quote, "I had an awesome respect and fear of the mystery of the sea, which had supreme power over us puny mortals. It had, after all, taken my strong grandfather." No, a heart attack. A heart attack took your grandfather. He wasn't swallowed by a sea monster or hit by a rogue wave. He had a heart attack on a boat at sea. Yes, I guess, but come on, dude. He goes on to say, quote, "I began to be strangled by a recurring nightmare around the notion that my grandfather would try to stop me rising to physical maturity by causing me to drown so that he could have me with him in the ground. I became wary of deep water because I thought that his force would still linger there and pull me down by the ankles until I drowned. At other times, I believed he could command the sea to do his will and engulf me," end quote. This is why I think he lies about a lot, right? Once again, why would your grandfather still be in the sea? He was never in the sea. He didn't drown at sea. He had a heart attack, and they brought him back to shore, and then he was buried. He's not still in the sea. So I don't know what he's talking about, but it's just this dramatic effect. This, I'm afraid of everything. I am just at the will of the forces around me, being pushed around by the waves of life. My grandfather is now Poseidon, controlling the sea to pull me down in the watery grave with him and the Titanic. Dennis claims he would wake up from these terrifying nightmares, which often included visions of himself lying dead and waxy in a child-sized coffin. He would awake from these dreams, nightmares, aroused. He wondered why he would want to be subjected to a feminine passive role unless there were two sides to his nature. The side that his grandfather represented, strong and dominant, and the side that was weak and powerless, helpless to do anything about what the stronger presence wanted. Yes, because us women are just so feminine and passive. We're just born as these passive, weak creatures. He's sexist, man. Sexist. And although, as far as we know, none of his victims were ever women, he clearly really has a problem with women, like resents them, looks at them as less than. Dennis began going out into the sea when no one else was around and half drowning himself before staggering to the shore and falling down, and then he would fantasize that he was being undressed by someone while he was lying on the beach like half unconscious. And this someone would be exploring his naked body and do things to him that he could not stop because he was unconscious. Dennis began fantasizing about another boy whose beauty sent his pulse racing and who he longed to be physically intimate with, but couldn't even strike up the bravery to talk to. At one point, Dennis shocked himself when he imagined hitting the boy over the head and rendering him unconscious. He had visions of this boy lying there, oblivious to what Dennis was doing, as he fondled his unconscious body. Dennis said the goal was never to hurt him, but to have him there so he could express tactile tenderness towards him. He wondered if that was how his grandfather had felt about him, and these thoughts began to sexually arouse him more and more, even though he felt ashamed by them and tried to push them from his mind. Dennis said, quote, "I was trapped in a primary dreamlike stage of emotional development, unable to progress, needing human contact, but at the same time fearful of rejection. There formed a concomitant emotional barrier to protect myself from the risk of hurt and to distance myself from my vital need," end quote. Dennis imagined that he himself was getting knocked out by an older man, or he imagined that he was doing the knocking out, and he enjoyed playing both of these parts equally. But in these fantasies, someone was always unconscious. In 1959, Dennis attended a summer camp with the local stricken troop of the Gordon Highlanders Army Cadets. He claims that during night duty, the adult sergeant sent the rest of the boys away and then gave 13-year-old Dennis alcohol to drink, telling him it would prove he was a man. Dennis said he passed out and he woke up in the morning, lying in a bed in the guardroom with a pounding headache. He didn't remember what had happened the night before, but he felt that his uniform wasn't fitting quite right, and he wondered if the sergeant had taken advantage of him the night before while he was unconscious. Later, he noticed that his underwear were inside out, as if he had been undressed and redressed by someone. Dennis began to have a serious passion for getting out of Stricken, a place he associated with stagnation. He felt he would never reach his true potential while he remained there. He wasn't doing well in school, he wasn't happy at home, and he remembered sitting in his classroom and staring out the window at the railroad tracks, imagining that they led to someplace better, someplace where he could be happy and accepted. When he was 15 years old, he asked his mother to sign the paperwork that would allow him to join the British Army, and in September of 1961, he left Stricken and traveled to St. Omar Barracks in Aldershot, Hampshire for training. Here, he continued to sneak into the bathroom at night to live out his fantasies, thinking about his brother Olav and his nighttime explorations of Olav's body. He said, quote, "I had two separate lives, the real life and the fantasy life. When I was with people, I was in the real world, but in my own private mind, I snapped easily into my fantasy life, and I could oscillate from one to the other with instant ease. Before I went to sleep at night, I would even go as far as to plan my dreams. I would slowly drift off with the warm, wondrous thoughts of my imagination, all framed, of course, in the movie camera lens." End quote. In the summer of 1964, Dennis Nilsen had completed training, and at the age of 18, he was assigned to the British Army of the Rhine in Germany. He was stationed at the Belfast Barracks in Westphalia, Germany, and since he had been trained as an army cook, he was assigned to the kitchens. During the day, he and his crew would cook meals, and at night they would drink beer at the camp bar before heading into town to drink some more. This is when Dennis Nilsen begins his love affair with alcohol, something that would last his entire life. In 1967, Dennis was sent to South Yemen for his next posting, and at night he would drink and go off base into what was a very war-torn and dangerous area. He tells a story of how one night he was drinking at the Mermaid Club, but he missed the armored car that was sent to the club to take the soldiers back to base each night, so he went outside and he grabbed a cab. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in the trunk of the cab, naked. When he heard the car stop, he pretended to be unconscious, and he felt around in the trunk for the tire iron. When the trunk opened and the taxi driver tried to pull him out, Dennis hit him on the head with the tire iron. At first, Dennis was scared, and he felt grateful to have escaped with his life, but this normal feeling was short-lived, and was soon replaced by a fantasy of what could have been. This guy, man, was truly twisted. He said, quote, "What would the taxi driver have done with me afterwards? What would have been the sequence of events? Was he intent on other extremes, to dismember and eat my flesh? No, dude, he probably just wanted to rob you." All these horrific wonders rushed through my imagination with escalating rapidity. I had feverish dreams of him, mustachioed a la Saddam Hussein, end quote. Oh my God. So, this fantasy, once again, is detailed and disturbing and involved not only the cab driver, but Dennis's grandfather, Andrew. The fantasy is basically Dennis being sexually assaulted by the cab driver and his grandfather, Andrew, both of them. He is then bathed, sprinkled with baby powder, red lipstick is applied to him, and then he's murdered and buried by the cab driver after his grandfather made him his wife. I would actually read you what he says about this fantasy, but I feel like your ears haven't given me consent to hear that, so I have to be respectful of that. By the end of 1967, Dennis was sent to the Persian Gulf, where he was stationed in the officers' mess hall, and here things were a little bit different. He had his own room and some privacy for the first time since being in the Army. Even in training, he didn't have his own room. So during this time, Dennis said he had access to a native servant boy who willingly provided sexual favors to the officers in exchange for money. He's such an idiot, man, Dennis Nilsen. This little boy was not providing sexual favors willingly He was doing it in exchange for money because he was poor, because his family didn't have enough to eat, because this was what his option was. It wasn't as if this is what he desired to do. It wasn't as if he woke up and said, I can't wait to do this. He was doing it because he had to, because there was no other choice. And Dennis over here, once again, the director of his own life story, is attributing this feeling of not only acceptance from this young boy, but desire. So Dennis claims he took the boy up on his offer, and for several weeks this was a regular thing until Dennis was moved to a new post, and he claims that the boy was very upset that Dennis had to go and leave and be stationed at a new post. Get the hell out of here, man. Delusional is not even a good word for it. But what Dennis had in his new barracks was a long floor-length mirror in his room that he would admire himself in. He said, quote, by positioning it at an angle, I could look at myself lying on the bed and I'd become aroused by my relaxed body. I imagined someone, the mirror's view, looking at me and lusting after my body. This was, of course, practical and visual nonsense, and there needed to be a second party. Therefore, I took steps to pretend that the image in the mirror was actually someone else. I repositioned it so that my head couldn't be seen reflected, and I imagined myself in the dominant role as well as the passive body in the mirror. The problem was that it just looked like me pretending to be asleep. I therefore had to make the image in the mirror look as unlike the real me as possible and be as truly passive and helpless for the imagined man to act dominantly upon it. I decided that the most passive and opposite from the real living me was the dead, helpless me. In the mirror, the man dominating my body had no face, but he was always a dirty, gray-haired old man, the polar opposite of the beautiful, smooth-skinned young man of my dreams. He would be in many different costumes and disguises, but he would always be that filthy, drooling, ugly old man, and I could make those scenarios seem real through my sheer need and willpower, though the process took some months to unfold and develop. End quote. So he says that he set his mirror up so that he could imagine somebody was like looking at him and lusting after him, whoever was, behind the mirror. And then he was like, that doesn't make sense though, because there is nobody behind the mirror. Like there has to be two people here. And his next thought is not like, well, maybe I should find somebody to be here with me, a healthy relationship of mutual respect and love. No. Instead, he said, let me pretend to be dead, and also let me pretend to be an ugly old drooling man who's taking advantage of my dead body. This was his solution. Dennis Nilsen said he went to extreme lengths to make himself look like a corpse. He sprinkled talcum powder all over his body to look like dust and sand and dirt and to make his skin look colorless. He rubbed charcoal under his eyes to make them look bloodshot and sunken. And he put holes in a t-shirt and then soaked the holes with saffron to make it look as if he had been shot. He said he would lay there, staring unblinking into the mirror, allowing saliva to drip from his mouth so he could step outside of himself and watch as this imaginary, disgusting old man did things to him, and then put him on a donkey's back in order to bring him into town and then sell his dead body. After doing this, he would wash up and then go hang out with the other guys as if nothing had happened. In January of 1968, Dennis Nilsen went back to England for the first time in years, where he was posted at the Seaton Barracks on the outskirts of Plymouth. He claims it was here he witnessed what he believed was a young woman being sexually abused. He said he was watching television in his room late one night when he got up to go to the bathroom. On his way back to his room, he passed another room with an open door, and he saw a woman sitting on a bed inside, cradling herself and crying. There was blood on her underwear and on the bed, and as he stared at her, a soldier walked out of the shadows and told Dennis that, he was done with her, so if Dennis wanted to turn, he could take her. Dennis claims he said absolutely not and told the soldier to get her out of there before they were all in trouble, and then he turned to leave, but not before he saw another soldier come in and carry the woman off to his room as she was still crying and whimpering. And then Dennis, this man has the balls to say, quote, the next morning, I was able to rationalize my feelings of guilt by reasoning, probably correctly, that the girl had been smuggled into the barracks of her own free will. She may have been a young virgin who, after the drink had flowed, found that matters had wandered out of her control. As there was no official complaint of anything alleged by anyone against the soldiers, I thrust the matter from the front of my mind." End quote. Like, this guy, I don't think he really actually knows what her own free will means. He doesn't have a concept of what free will actually means. She went to the barracks of her own free will as a young virgin who had had too much to drink? Come on, man. Dennis Nilsen lived in a movie, but this one had a pretty unbelievable plot. Dennis also tells a story of being on a train with a young man that he called Stuart. He said he and Stuart, they were living it up in the bar car, drinking, and then they took the party back to their seating compartment where Dennis had a bottle of Remy Martin in his suitcase. Eventually, Stuart drank so much that he fell asleep, waking up only to vomit, so Dennis, being the nice, helpful guy that he is, he brought him to the bathroom because this kid could barely walk, but as soon as the door was closed and locked behind them, he claimed his mind raced into sexual overdrive. In order to make sure that Stuart was truly passed out, Dennis lifted his head and let it fall. And then it hit the toilet hard. And then he started to undress him, but he was interrupted by a knock at the door. So he had to stop. Next, Dennis went to Berlin, where he got himself a video camera and he began recording everything. Dennis was actually also sent to Balmoral Castle, the royal family's Scotland home, to be a part of the Queen's Guard for the annual Gillies Ball. He took a great deal of pleasure filming everything he saw, from the Highland Games to the Queen's Guards to the ceremonies. Dennis also worked as a projectionist at the base movie theater at the Maybury Club. It was here he met a man who would become important to him for many years. He calls him Jamie Foster, but that is not his real name. Jamie apparently was 18 years old. Dennis was 26 at this time. They drank together. Dennis taught Jamie how to run the projection equipment. They took long walks together where Dennis would film wildlife, but his favorite camera subject was Jamie himself. Dennis said, quote, "I often filmed him in slow motion, running and jumping. I filmed him climbing and in the full range of unusual situations. In one, he feigned being shot, and as he fell, I tracked the camera to where he lay asleep. I lingered the shot on him for a full 5 seconds and was excited by the passive image of him. Later, when he wasn't around, I would watch the footage of him and go into the bathroom to masturbate." End quote. But one day, Dennis took it a bit too far with Jamie, and Jamie got spooked when Dennis suggested that they should go to the laundry room to be alone together. Jamie distanced himself, and not long after, Dennis discovered that the object of his affection had been hanging out with a closeted sergeant. One day, Dennis confronted the sergeant, who simply told him that it was Jamie's choice. Jamie had the right to choose who he wanted to be with, and he hadn't chosen Dennis. Dennis would go on to confront Jamie directly. They got into a physical fist fight, but Dennis claims he didn't fight back. He just laid there and let Jamie beat on him. After the loss of Jamie, Dennis realized he no longer wanted to be in the army. He didn't even want to be in Scotland at all, so he burned all the reels of films he had taken except for the films he had of Jamie, which he says he gave to Jamie the day he left the military for good. And I'm sure Jamie wasn't creeped out by that at all. He then spent 2 weeks at home in Stricken before boarding a train that would bring him to London, a city that he would go on to terrorize, later claiming he only wanted someone in his life who would stay. Someone who would remain with him even once the sun rose the next morning. All Dennis Nilsen ever really wanted was companionship, even if he had to kill to get it. And that's where we'll end today's video, and we'll pick up in part 2 with what Dennis is up to once he gets to London. And nothing good. Nothing good. Make sure to like this video if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share the video if you think it's worth sharing. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. My handles are in the description, usually just Stephanie Harlowe or Steph Harlowe. And don't forget to follow my podcast, Crime Weekly, that I co-host with retired police detective Derek Levasseur. We have new episodes go out on audio platforms every Friday, and the video version comes out on our YouTube channel the following Wednesday. Links are in the description box. Also, don't forget to check out Native. Click the link in the description box. Use my code. Start using Native products. They are awesome. Thank you guys so much for being here. Let me know what you think in the comments. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.
Straight down in that river. till it's killing you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood on the strings.